All right.
All right.
So, today we're going to talk a little about a few things actually, but mostly we're going to talk about harmony and thinking about harmony and scales and the like. With several of you, I've been talking about trying to get more interest, more dissonance on dominant chords and whatnot, and that's in large part because I hear a lot of diatonic playing, and I also do not hear a lot of tension on the dominant chords. So why is it that I'm harping on dominant chords all the time? Anybody have an answer?
I mean, they're kind of the color providing, I don't know, chords and
Okay.
or I mean, well, like tension release, like you said.
Okay.
It's like the most effective way to add dissonance and color, but it's all like second answer. It's also like built off a tritone, which is
That's
like
key.
the definition of dissonance, basically.
So the tritone's built into the dominant chord, right? So 3/7, you have that tritone, and that tritone, the devil's interval, is an interval that wants to resolve in some way, shape, or form. In its present state, just playing a dominant chord, there is tension. And so movement's baked into the cake with the dominant chord. It's not so with the minor 7 chord or the major 7 chord. Both of those can function as tonics. So of course, given context, you can create movement with both of those chords, but in general, those chords are going to be fairly static, okay? Whereas the dominant is going to inherently want to move somewhere. So we've already got that built in. What's more, the dominant can house a lot of different non-harmonic tones, okay? We've talked a bit about them. You can alter the 9, you can alter the 5, you can alter the 13, you can alter the 11. You can play a lot of stuff on dominant chords, and in fact, you can play as outside as you want on dominant chords as long as you resolve into the tonic, if you've got a 5-1 movement. And nobody's going to give you any grief about it, because there's an expectation from the ear that there's going to be some tension on the dominant. So in jazz, particularly bebop and beyond, we want to take advantage of these dominant chords. You didn't hear these kinds of alterations on dominant chords before bebop came around. Maybe once in a while you had a sharp 5 or something. But bebop was where we got into a lot of dissonant intervals and a lot of non-harmonic tones as part of the style. And so dominant chords are where we want to take advantage of playing something interesting, colorful. It's really where we get the most advantage to create color across the harmonic spectrum. So, I want to back up just a little bit and talk about perspective as it relates to harmony. There's several levels of harmonic thinking. And the first level, the broadest level, would be basically the tune level. So on the tune level, you look at a lead sheet and you see maybe it's got a key signature, maybe it doesn't. But you can ascertain fairly quickly in most, certainly standard tunes, that there is a key center to the piece. So when we talk about playing Great Dolphin Street in C or E flat, those are traditional keys that we play that tune in. And though the C, say we're playing it in C, C is a dominant tone throughout the tune. Doesn't mean that we go and take some harmonic detours, go into different keys, but you've got a basic structure on a certain key center. Then we go to the actual key level. So when we talk about keys, we talk about, let's take Green Dolphin Street. We're in C, so we've got basically a C pedal point for the first several bars, and we've got a planing harmonic sound going over it. So we've got C major, what?
C minor.
C minor,
And D7 over C.
D7 or D, then
D flat.
D flat. So while we've taken a detour from a harmonic standpoint, the key level is still C. C's hanging out there. And then the first turnaround, C to A7, and then what happens?
2-5-1.
2-5-1 in C. So we're not far, we're what, 12 bars into the tune, and we haven't really departed from C. And then what happens next?
2-5-1 and E flat.
2-5-1 and E flat. So on the key level, we're basically in C for 12 bars, and then we go to E flat for a few bars. Then we're back in C, go to the second half of the tune. Not a lot is different until the last 8 bars, right? And then what happens in the last 8 bars?
Minor 2-5 to A. Minor. Or unless you just think about that as being C still.
No, well, it's the relative minor, of course, but it does sound like a key change. And that's really the central idea of keys changing in a tune. It's not from a theoretical standpoint that we want to base our knowledge, it's what we hear. We hear a definite key change. We're going from major to minor. Yeah, those keys are related, but it's definitely a change in key. And then what?
2-5 into E minor.
2-5 into E minor. So that's a pretty big departure until we realize, oh, well, E is going to be the 3 into a 3-6-2-5-1. So, yeah, you've got a little departure to A minor, it feels like a departure to E minor, but really, we're not far from C through the entire second half of the tune. So on a key level, for Green Dolphin Street, there's not a lot of difference between the tune level and the key level. A tune like Stella by Starlight, different scenario, right? There are 2 5s going all over the place, and a lot of those 2 5s don't actually establish keys, so it becomes much more difficult to even deal with it on the key level. So then we go down to the chord level. So what would the chord level be? Individual chords. And really, when you talk about the chord level, you're also talking about the scale level, right? Why would I say that? I think some of us have talked about this before. In fact, Kyle, you and I were talking about this just yesterday.
Like each chord quality is matched with a scale that sounds good when you play it.
More than that, let's just step back a minute and talk about how we build these chords. And I don't know how much you guys have done this sort of thing, but let's take a fairly simple example. What chord quality is that?
Dominant.
Dominant sharp 11.
Yeah, so it's a C13 sharp 11. And we've just created it vertically in a tertiary fashion, meaning in thirds. So if you lay that out in scale fashion, what do you have?
Lydian dominant.
Yeah, or whatever you'd like to call it. Mixolydian sharp 4, all sorts of things. Another way of looking at it is G melodic minor ascending, right? But let's not get too far into that. But the fact is, when we stack the chord up, the scale is right there. It's embedded in the chord. So what we were talking about, Kyle, is the chicken and egg syndrome, right? Don't know which came first, but they are basically the same thing. You're just organizing the material in a different way, okay? So one of the things that I'm trying to impress upon you as piano players is that we have this topography to work with. It's not a uniform topography, 3 black, 2 black, this sort of thing. But the more you familiarize with the topography of the piano, the more you see this, and this as being one and the same. And so when you go to play voicings, you're not necessarily going here, you're going here. And in many ways, this is an easier construct for the mind, laid out for you. When you stack things, it creates a different model for the brain in the sense that you are thinking vertically and it brings up different notions. For example, and this is something we're going to talk a little bit about, you have a D major chord on top of a C7 chord. So why is that important? Well, if I'm going to play C7 sharp 11, C13 sharp 11, whatever, I'm going to probably play a standard voicing in the left hand, and immediately I think, and here, a big D chord in the right hand. So if you know that and hear that, you can grab it. And I keep talking about this physiological, neurological connection that we need to have as piano players, and as all musicians, but you get a sound in your mind and you connect it with a physiological response. You connect the two, and then you have an emotional connection. You hear the chord and there's an emotion behind it because you've heard it in a lot of different contexts, and those contexts are perhaps on a recording, live music, whatnot, and of course some of your heroes play this kind of thing, and they play on a very deep emotional level, and so it's embedded with that emotion. And so having this kind of knowledge inside of you, basically, neurologically, really furthers your ability to create art on the piano. So this is the chord scale level, and they're basically one and the same. So then, coming from here, we go one more level down, and that is non-harmonic tones. And why are non-harmonic tones important? Anybody?
Is that where you're getting tension?
Yeah.
You wanna add tension?
Yeah. Non-harmonic tones are full of tension, right? And I'm talking about specifically non-harmonic tones being tones that, for example, in a C13 sharp 11, are not in this scale. So when you're talking about non-harmonic tones, you're talking about this and this and this and this and this and this. So you add the two together and what do you get?
Chromatic scale?
Chromatic scale. All 12 tones. So the chromatic palette is what we're working with. And we're basically choosing notes within that chromatic palette as tools to improvise. And we're trying to fit those notes that we choose into these chords stay in the key to play the tune, right? So one of the things that we've talked about in the bebop language is the use of non-harmonic tones. Non-harmonic tones not being something you play with the purpose of playing outside, but you use in more of a Baroque type of classical way. You're using them as preparations for harmonic tones. So you can use them as appoggiaturas, you can use them as turns around notes, neighboring tones, all of that sort of thing. Obviously, we aren't bound by the rules of Baroque music at all, but it's important to understand that non-harmonic tones are not off limits for a jazz player, particularly in the 21st century. The idea of learning the bebop language is important not from necessarily a historical context, but just that great bebop players have all sorts of attributes. And we're focusing specifically on the harmonic attributes here. Obviously time and technique and all that sort of thing, but Kyle had everything. He didn't have the modern left hand, we talked about that, but he could drive a band with his right hand. And of course there are apocryphal stories of him being able to play everything he played with the right hand with his left hand. So there's always that as a piano player. Weak left hands. Seems like everybody's got one. You strengthen your left hand and you open up a whole vista, a whole wide territory of expression. But that's another topic as well. So, in the bebop language, non-harmonic tones are approach tones mostly, and so anytime you've got a dominant chord, this sort of thing, that's the simplest version of using non-harmonic tones. And some of those are actually harmonic tones. Mixing and matching all the time, but certainly if you do appoggiaturas and neighboring tones, you're going to hit some tones that are not in the chord or in the scale, and those are going to give you some bite. And you can play those tones on any chord, not just dominant chords. We'll get to the dominant chords in a second, but the bottom line is if you're playing, say, D minor 11. Guess we've got a 13 in there as well, that's fine. There's a non-harmonic tone that is really useful and important, right? Here's a non-harmonic tone that is really useful and important for a variety of reasons. Anytime you do something like this into a chord tone, you're using a non-harmonic tone. So awareness of non-harmonic tones is really important. But of course you can't be aware of non-harmonic tones if you don't know the scale you're using, you don't know the inside. You go outside until you know the inside. You can't run until you walk. Now some people will do that. The question is how effective they are. Because this music demands a high level of artistry, high level of skills, and we want to build those skills so we can get to that place. Everybody has something to say. Everybody in this room has something to say in this music, something to contribute to this music. It's just a matter of getting to the point where you have the tools to say what you have to say, okay? And clarify what you have to say. Oftentimes it's a feeling rather than a mental construct, and that's better than a mental construct any day, because we're dealing with the arts, we're dealing with music. But we got mental constructs all over the place, and the more we can internalize the mental constructs to the point where we don't have to think about them anymore, then we're golden, okay? Because then we can get to the conceptual level and start thinking about building new music, exploring new ideas. So, let's get into some dominant chords. So just like we built that C7 sharp 11, let's just give ourselves a basic C7 chord. All right. So start throwing out possible alterations on this thing.
Sharp 9.
And then
Sharp 11.
flat 13.
Sharp 5.
And then flat 5.
Okay. Those are our basic alterations. The 9s, the 5s, 13. And we've talked about this. How are these different?
Depends on the other notes in the chord.
And what would the other notes in the chord be?
Um,
So these are the same note, but why would we notate them differently? Why would we call a sharp 5 a flat 13? Yes.
So if in a C7, if there's a G and a G sharp, that's a flat 13,
Although you'd spell it as
A
an
flat.
A flat, yeah.
A flat. And then
Yeah.
if there's a flat and, or a G sharp and an A, then that's a sharp 5.
Say that again.
Or, if there's a G sharp and an A, that's a sharp 5.
Generally not. The basic rule is you got a flat 13, you've got a natural 5 in there, period. Sharp 5 usually says what harmonically?
An alt chord.
Augmented. Sharp 5 is an augmented chord. So there's in an augmented scale, which is what? What's it called?
Whole tone?
Whole tone. The whole tone scale, there is no 13. This is a 6-note scale. So the whole tone doesn't really fit into this rubric so much, in the sense that we can't really build an augmented chord up into upper structures, because there generally aren't many there. You do have a 9, but what would be the 11, or the sharp 11, is actually the flat 5. So these two often are found together, not all the time, but the sharp 11 also means you got a natural 5. So these are the same note, but they're not just enharmonic spellings, right? All right. So let's move over here. Okay. So, one of the rules is that anytime you have a sharp 9, you're gonna have a flat 9, and vice versa. Anytime you have a sharp 5, you're gonna have a flat 5, and vice versa. So, anytime you see C7 alt, that's simply shorthand for C7 with flat 9, sharp 9, flat 5, sharp 5. Now, you will see cases, particularly in big band tunes, where you'll have the arranger say, I want this chord, the arranger is asking for a specific sound, meaning you as the piano player, as much as this is equal to the alt chord, the arranger doesn't want to hear sharp 9, doesn't want to hear sharp 5. Because in the horns, there is no sharp 9 and sharp 5. And so you throw those in there and it creates a different sound, and that's not the sound the arranger is asking for. So, you have to be adept with all of the permutations, right? And they all sound a little different. And of course, you may have a melody that's got some funky note in it that tells you he's asking for a flat 5, but there's actually, there's a 13 in there, or there may be a natural 5 in there. You'll see all sorts of permutations of this. As we grow and progress in this music, composers and arrangers are always looking for new sounds and new textures. So it puts the onus on us as musicians to be able to read this stuff and be able to give the arranger or composer what they want. But let's just stick with this for now. All those combinations are possible. So, here's your 9, and that's going to be sharp or flat. And then where do we go from here?
Sharp 11?
Okay, so what's wrong with this chord so far? If this is a C7 alt, there's something wrong already.
Is it the natural 5?
Yeah, the natural 5. Okay. So again, like I was talking about with C+7, there's no place to go once you get up to the sharp, and the sharp 11, which is actually wrong. This should be this, but you'll see the scale written like this often. But that's mostly for reading purposes. It doesn't really reflect exactly what's going on. From a jazz perspective, this should be the flat 5, this should be the sharp 5. And this should be the flat 7. But it looks funky when you write it, right? Then technically you have to do this. That's hard to read. So lots of shorthand goes on in jazz. Sometimes it's okay, sometimes it's to the music's detriment, because this is why we have so many problems with nomenclature in this music, is that everybody's taken shortcuts for so long. And, of course, to the historical perspective, this music is based on oral tradition. So a lot of this stuff wasn't theorized. Obviously, Dizzy knew what he was doing when he was, creating, he was one of the creators of bebop, and he had a pretty adept theoretical mind, was able to pull things apart. Monk very much too, and they knew exactly what they were doing. It wasn't just lightning bolt struck and then bebop was born. Young, outrageously talented, and ambitious people who took the horse by the reins and changed music in a dramatic way. When you think about the late 30s, early 40s, what was going on in jazz, in music in general?
Swing?
Yeah, we were near the end of the swing era. So what was the swing era all about?
Dancing.
Very much so. And dancing to what? format.
Big band?
Big bands. It was the big band era. Yeah. So the small group thing was kind of shunted off to the side. You know, Benny Goodman was one of the few players who departed from a big band type of format with his quartet with Lionel Hampton and Teddy Wilson, man. I mean, geez. But that was very rare. The small group was very rare, and so that was a huge change. And bebop was largely made for listening, not dancing. You know, art music, if you want to call it that. And of course, the tempos did not necessarily promote people coming out on the dance floor. Because you know, in both directions, ballads got slower, so you couldn't find, you know, what am I dancing to? And then, of course, the fast tunes got faster and faster. And of course, the crowd, a lot of the crowd's just bewildered. They don't know what's going on stage. It's a language they don't understand or can't relate to. And compared to what was relatively tame in many areas in the big band era, I mean, the most popular bands were the sweet bands, you know, that were sweet and syrupy, and you know, and it's funny that you had several big bands that kept going through the 40s and beyond. And can you think of the most famous ones? Not anything that was created in the, say, 70s or 80s, but bands that actually persisted through the 50s and 60s.
Oh, Count Basie.
Count Basie was one of them. So Count Basie is one of the swingingest bands on earth. But when they did their tour, much of what they did was play for dancing. And I wasn't around. I remember they did come to Missoula in the 70s, and I know that my parents went to hear them. It was probably like a dinner dance date kind of thing, but it must have been just great to dance to. Who else?
Duke Ellington.
Duke Ellington, until he died in 1974, and then of course the ghost bands.
I think of like Thad Jones, Mel Lewis.
Yeah, but that's a later
Okay.
big band. So Stan Kenton.
Glenn Miller? Glenn Miller Orchestra?
Well, Glenn Miller died in the Second World War, or disappeared. And so, I'm not talking about ghost bands.
Okay.
Yeah, there was a version of the Glenn Miller band that went on, still goes on. In fact, Buddy DeFranco led the Glenn Miller band for several years in the 60s. So probably the most famous from a television watching perspective was Lawrence Welk.
Yeah.
And Lawrence Welk was the king of the sweet bands. And you can still watch Lawrence Welk. I mean, it still shows up on television. And you can see what it's all about. It's paste a smile on your face and play. I mean, there were great players in there, don't get me wrong. He hired great players, but you know, the time feel alone is dotted 8th, 16th, you know, it's and everybody's playing with a smile, and you know, I mean, there are some incredible things that go on in the band, but it's pure commercial music for my grandparents. I know because we would go over to their house on Sunday evenings and Lawrence Welk was always on. So anyway, that's a little divergence, but this sort of stuff isn't going on in the Lawrence Welk band. You know, the Lawrence Welk band actually has a lesson to teach everybody, and that is know the melody, and if you screw up the melody, you know, because that's all people wanna hear. They don't wanna hear you going off when they're dancing. They wanna hear the melody because they, you know, particularly my grandparents' generation, and even my parents' generation. My mother was born in 1938, and hey, she grew up listening to the radio, and the radio was full of the Great American Songbook, because it was still alive and kicking in the 40s and 50s. And so she knew the words to hundreds of songs. It was unbelievable. But those songs were rarely in a version that you heard this sort of language, right? So bebop is a divergence from this mainstream, more commercial fare that most people know about and perhaps like. And we still see some of that big band tradition happening with singers like Michael Bublé, you know, and of course Tony Bennett, bless his soul, has recorded and played with a number of big bands through the years. The Sinatra phenomenon and the big bands, that's some of the most incredible writing for big band out there. But this is really modern language. And this is where we want to create the interest. So let's go back to thinking about where you're going to find this interest. And we're in dominant chords, and what's the most present chord progression in jazz?
2-5-1.
The 2-5-1. 2-5-1 is everywhere, even in a lot of modern compositions. So mastery of the 2-5-1 leads to a certain level of mastery as a jazz musician. And that mastery is really about treating the dominant seventh chord. So, where do we go from here? We've got all these choices. These choices can be bewildering. So you gotta pare it down. You gotta master one thing at a time. So who in here can play that first scale that I put up on the board, the Lydian dominant or the Mixolydian sharp 4 scale, in all keys, right now? Okay, we've got a taker.
Should I do both hands or just one hand?
Both hands is great.
Okay, how many octaves?
Let's do at least 2 octaves.
Okay. beware. Raise your hand, you may have to demonstrate what you say you can do. So,
Dylan's almost ready to go to the next scale, but almost. Why? Because there are hesitations there,
Yeah.
right? You wanna know those scales like the back of your hand. And it's not that I'm promoting doing these exercises, you know. You do the scale around the circle of fifths, do it in chromatics, do it in half steps, do it whatever. There are lots of ways to skin the cat when it comes to designing exercises so that you know these things. But the main thing is application, having the knowledge and applying it to a tune. That's where everything comes together, everything congeals for you when you can play that scale at will on a dominant seventh chord embedded in a tune. And you have lots of opportunities, right? Because every tune you play, you're gonna see these dominant seventh chords, these 2-5-1s. But the bottom line is, you're still formulating the scales in your head as you play. You jump to the next key, and of course, as we wind down to the bottom, the precarious bottom of the
Yeah.
signal fits, things get a little more tenuous.
Yeah.
And that's just the way it is, right? Those keys we're less familiar with. We play very few tunes in those heavy, 4 or 5 flats, 6 flats, 4, 5, 6 sharps, rarely. So that's a word to the wise, of course. If we're gonna learn a tune, we wanna learn it in all keys. Because if we're just gonna go with the key that the tune's in, we're gonna get really good at C and F and B flat and pretty good at E flat, not so good at A flat, probably not great at D flat, and forget about G flat. And then the other way gets worse, right? We know G and D because, 1 sharp, 2 sharps, I can handle that. But A, unless you play some tunes in A, you're gonna stink in A. And then E, forget it. B, forget it. Flat keys are easier to play on the piano than sharp keys in general. But sharp keys, like I've said to some of you, sharp keys open up a whole nother tonal palette, right? A whole other color scheme. So think about that. Obviously everybody's crunched for time. Always consider how much you can cut back on this thing, the computer in your hand, and how much of that time can go there. But putting a key through, or a tune through 12 keys is a time costly endeavor. So be smart about it. So let's take Green Dolphin Street, for example. We know it's in C, we know it in E flat. Make sure you know it in both keys. Make sure you know the melody in both keys and can play it convincingly. And then play it in A, and play it in D flat. Play it in some distantly related keys. You don't have to go through the cycle. You don't have to go play it in F. You don't have to play it in B flat. You'll probably see it in F once in a while. It's good to play it in F. But that's why I like to play tunes like that in 2 keys at once. So C and E flat and G flat. And then you get the benefit in one chorus of playing the tune, basically playing the tune in 2 keys. And then you have to deal with getting from one key to the other in a smooth and convincing fashion. So, oftentimes, to really get this kind of information into your noggin, it's good to dial back. We've gone through all sorts of stuff up here, and it's a lot of information to process. One of the scales that we've talked a lot about is the half-whole scale. Half-whole scale is a high utility scale for dominant 7 chords. It's basically the dominant 13 flat 9. Obviously it has a sharp 11. But unlike the altered chord, which can be so full of dissonance that it almost has a consonant sound to it, the half whole with the flat 9, sharp 9, and sharp 11, natural 13, maintains its sound as the dominant chord. and has some really organic leads that will get you back into the tonic. But it's a difficult scale, and I'm not saying that if you don't master the Mixolydian sharp 4 or whatever, you can't play that full. But you have to manage your time and resources. So you really want to focus on mastering some of this material, not just glossing over it. So one thing that you could consider is take a week or two on each one of these scales. So let's outline what these scales would be. So obviously Mixolydian is our basic go-to, right? So when we talk about that first level, the tune level, when we drop to the key level, the Mixolydian's on the key level, meaning Mixolydian is the same thing as the Ionian mode in the key, right? So if you're in C scale starting on G is the Mixolydian. So that's the whitewash method. You play all white keys in C, and you will not play a wrong note, right? We're beyond that, obviously. So Lydian dominant. This adds one level of interest. Dissonance, yes. Why is the sharp 11 dissonant?
Tritone.
Yeah, it's a tritone with the root. But the funny thing about the sharp 11 is that it doesn't sound functionally like a tritone. Because again, when we built this chord back here, that D major sound over C sounds really consonant and sounds really stable. Doesn't feel like it has to move. But it's this interval, obviously, that still rules and wants to go inward, right? Wants to collapse. Okay, so thanks to Dylan, we've heard our bill of Lydian dominance for the day. Where do we go from here?
Would you go to like augmented the whole time?
Okay, we can do that.
Do you see that as like kind of the next like step of dissonance that you can get? Or do you kind of see that off in its own little world?
I do see it as being in its own little world. It's really a specialty scale, because it's not truly built on the modal system. It's a, in a way, it's a manufactured scale. It's whole tones. We just put whole tones together, and here we are. We have it. This is one instance where, honestly, an augmented chord probably came first, an augmented sound. The whole tone is odd in the sense that even though it's a dominant chord, it also doesn't feel like it needs to resolve. And that's proven time and again in the music of Claude Debussy, and to a lesser extent in Ravel, but they both use the whole tone sound and the augmented chord pretty extensively as tonic sounds. So you never, if you had a C pedal and you're, say Debussy in one particular prelude, it's C pedal and you've got this wash of whole tone sound, never goes to F, never was intended to go to F. If it went to F, the whole thing would just implode because of the whole style would disappear. So whole tone is just a little bit of an outlier. And it's also a sound that's I'll put this lightly, it's a sound that's a little more, it's more acceptable than diminished chord, a bald-faced, just diminished sound in jazz. If you play this as a voicing, or if you play that outlined in a improvisation, it sounds anachronistic. It sounds like, wow, you just came out of 1935, pre-bebop. Whole tone's a little different because there is a certain modernism about whole tone. Diminished chords have been around for as long as tonal music. Well, that's not true. But a real diminished chord certainly found its way into early Baroque. And you hear a lot of pure diminished sounds in Bach's works, and Mozart's works, and Beethoven's works, and throughout the Romantic era. And it only kind of disappears once the 20th century starts. But even Richard Strauss is writing all sorts of stuff with pure diminished chords. But he's also going off and throwing a bunch of color into his compositions as well. So that's another side of modernism. But certainly the whole tone was not an acceptable sound up until the Romantic era, really late Romantic, and wasn't really popularized until the Impressionists came along. So it's a more modern sound, and certainly there are compositions out there based on this. Juju, Wayne Shorter, B whole tone is the first big long chord, and that tune with B whole tone forces you as an improviser to come up with something to say on a whole tone scale, which is really hard. It's, because it's really hard when you play the whole tone to hear those non-harmonic tones. How do you approach this scale from a non-harmonic tone perspective? It's really hard. Anyway, that's another discussion. So let's just go like this. Where do we go from here?
Is it half hold?
Okay, I would agree with that. So, half whole. Again, all of these have numerous names. I think half whole is one of the better names because it describes what the scale is, the intervals of the scale. If you call it diminished 2, that doesn't tell you anything and makes it actually more confusing. And so here we have and natural 13. So we're gradually building and gaining more and more tension within these chords. Then what?
Unaltered.
Actually, there's one I would throw in before we get to the fully altered chord.
Is it super loquium?
That's on the fully altered chord.
Oh.
This is the dominant seventh that I've talked to you guys about that you use in a minor key.
Oh, like a harmonic minor scale?
Yeah. So. From the 4th degree. So in F minor, if you're in F minor and you've got a C7 chord, what would the scale be?
Half harmonic minor.
F harmonic minor. So easy. That's so easy. And this is purely no sharp 9. So this is one instance where we break our rule that we're talking about over here. And that's because that's where we have the natural third, and between these two we have that augmented second interval, right? Aug. defines the harmonic minor sound, okay? And then, finally, altered. And that's gonna give us the whole boat. Okay, so. That's basically the spectrum. And there are, of course, other scales that we could throw in there. Again, there are more manufactured types of scales, but this is the basic setup for a jazz musician playing bebop type material, and further on tunes that have dominant chords.